Wednesday night, one night before Thursday. Maya sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the cream-colored card in her hand. She had been looking at it for 40 minutes. The 4 words were written in Mrs. Chen's handwriting, the same careful, precise handwriting that had written, "Eat before you go," on the morning of her first day. She put the card on the desk. She went to knock on Mrs. Chen's door. Mrs. Chen opened it before the second knock. She looked at Maya. She looked at the card in Maya's hand.
Come in.
They sat in their usual places, Maya on the sofa, Mrs. Chen in the armchair. Outside, Singapore, at night. Maya put the card on the table between them. "I need you to explain this to me."
What would you like to know?
Everything.
Marcus Hartwell came to Singapore 11 years ago. He was 47. He had just sold the European division of his company for a number I will not tell you because it would change how you see him before you have formed your own opinion.
What was he like?
He was the kind of man who had been successful for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to want something he didn't have. Not arrogant, something more complicated than arrogant. Completed. Like a sentence that had already reached its full stop.
And then?
And then he walked into a meeting at Meridian Advisory, my husband's company, my company. And he sat across from Robert and from me, and we talked for 2 hours about his portfolio and his plans and his vision for the next decade. And at the end of the 2 hours, he looked at me and he said something that no client had ever said to me before. In 20 years of running that company, not one.
What did he say?
He said, "I've been talking to financial advisors for 20 years. You're the first one who asked me what I actually want, rather than what I want to do with my money."
What's the difference?
That is exactly what he said I would ask. What you want to do with your money is a transaction. What you actually want is a life. Most financial advisors are trained to manage the transaction. They are not trained to sit with a person and ask what the transaction is for.
And you did?
Robert did. I listened. And after the meeting, Marcus Hartwell signed with Meridian. Not because our returns were better, because someone asked him the right question.
The 4 words.
He wrote them on a card and gave it to Robert at the end of that first meeting. He said, "This is what I actually want. If Meridian can help me with this, I will be your client for as long as you'll have me."
He's had 4 managers in 3 years. None of them knew about this card?
Robert knew. I knew. When Robert died and I left the company, I took the card. I don't know if David knows.
Why did you give it to me?
Because tomorrow you are going to sit in a room with a man who has been asking a question for 11 years. And every person who has sat in that room has tried to answer a different question. The question they thought he was asking.
And you think I'll ask the right one?
I think you might. If you remember what the card says, and you don't try to be impressive.
Why me? David could have given this to the previous managers.
David doesn't have the card. I have the card.
Why did you keep it?
Because when they asked me to leave the company, the card was the one thing I took that belonged to the work rather than to me personally. Everything else I left. But this I kept.
You kept it because you were going to use it. You've been waiting for someone David would send. Someone young enough not to have learned the wrong habits yet. Someone who would come here and sit on this sofa and ask the right questions instead of preparing the right answers.
3 years.
Maya sat with that. 3 years. 4 managers. 3 years of David sending someone to this building. 3 years of Mrs. Chen watching and deciding and waiting. What if I get it wrong tomorrow?
Then you get it wrong.
And Marcus Hartwell will leave Meridian?
Marcus Hartwell will not leave Meridian
Why not?
because he is not there for the financial advice. He has people for that. He is there because Meridian is the last place that asked him what he actually wanted. He stays because leaving would mean giving up on the possibility that someone might ask again.
Maya stood. She picked up the card. Can I keep it until tomorrow?
It was always yours to keep.
Maya walked to the door. She stopped. Mrs. Chen, what do the 4 words mean to you?
They are the same 4 words I would have written, if anyone had ever thought to ask me. Go to sleep.
She opened the door.
I stepped into the corridor. The door closed behind me. I stood there for a long time, longer than I should have, probably. The card was in my hand. 4 words. I read them again in the half-light of the corridor. Then I went to my apartment. I did not sleep, but I lay in the dark and I thought about questions and answers and the difference between them. I thought about a man who had been waiting 11 years for someone to ask the right thing. I thought about a woman who had kept a card for 3 years and lived in a small apartment and left food outside doors and never explained why, until tonight.
At 6 a.m., she got up.
I ironed my clothes. I made coffee. I stood at the window and looked at Singapore waking up, the city that had not known I existed 4 months ago and still did not know exactly, but was beginning to learn the shape of me. I put the card in the inside pocket of my jacket, close to where I could feel it without reaching for it. I left at 8:15. I did not knock on Mrs. Chen's door. I did not need to. I already had everything she had for me. The question was whether I would know when to use it.
Thursday, 2 o'clock, Meridian Advisory, 12th floor. The elevator opened and Marcus Hartwell was already there.
I don't know what I expected. Someone larger, maybe. Someone whose presence announced itself before he spoke. But Marcus Hartwell was simply still. 58 years old, silver gray hair, the kind of suit that costs enough to be invisible. He was standing at the window when David brought me in, looking at Singapore the way people look at cities they have seen so many times. The view has stopped being a view and become a habit.
He turned when the door opened. He looked at David. Then he looked at Maya. He held the look for 3 seconds. Not rudely, not warmly. The way someone looks at something they are trying to place.
He said, "You're new."
Not a question.
I said, "I've been here 4 months." He said, "That's new." He sat down. We sat down. David opened the meeting the way David opened everything, precisely, efficiently, without a single unnecessary word. Portfolio performance, market analysis, projected returns for the next 2 quarters. Marcus Hartwell listened. He asked 2 questions, both of which David answered without hesitation. And then there was a pause. The kind of pause I recognized now. The kind that meant something was about to be asked that the numbers couldn't answer.
Hartwell looked at Maya.
He said, "What do you think?" Not about the portfolio, not about the numbers, just, "What do you think?" I felt David beside me, very still. I thought about the card in my inside pocket. I thought about Mrs. Chen at her window, 43 years of knowing things she was never asked. I thought about 11 years of a question that kept not getting answered. And I said, "I think the numbers are fine. I think that's not what you're here for."
The room went very quiet. David did not move. Marcus Hartwell looked at Maya for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, the way light shifts when a cloud moves, slow, certain.
He said, "Go on." I said, I think you've been coming here for 11 years because this is the last place that asked you what you actually want. And I think nobody has asked you again since. And I think you stay because you haven't given up on the possibility that someone might. He looked at me. I said, "So I'm asking, what do you actually want, Mr. Hartwell?"
The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence Maya had ever sat in. Fuller than the 4-second pause in the interview. Fuller than the corridor outside Mrs. Chen's door. Fuller than 43 years in a small apartment, waiting for someone to send the right person.
Marcus Hartwell looked at his hands. Then he looked at me. And he said 4 words. The same 4 words that were written on the card in my inside pocket. Word for word. Exactly.
Maya did not look at David. She did not reach for the card. She simply looked at Marcus Hartwell and understood, for the first time, what Mrs. Chen had meant when she said, "It was always yours to keep."
I said, "Then let's start there."
After the meeting, David walked Marcus Hartwell to the elevator. Maya sat alone in the meeting room for a moment. The Singapore skyline through the glass. The city that was beginning to learn the shape of her. She reached into her inside pocket. She took out the card. She looked at the 4 words one more time. Then she put it back. She would not need to look at it again. She had heard them spoken out loud now, in the voice of the man who had written them. And they meant exactly what she thought they meant. And they were exactly what she would have written too, if anyone had ever thought to ask. She thought about SpeakPro, the app she had downloaded 3 weeks after arriving in Singapore, on a night when she could not sleep and was practicing the pause, speaking sentences into her phone at 2 a.m., and listening to the honest feedback that told her not what she wanted to hear, but what she needed to know. She had not thought of it as practice then. She had thought of it as survival. Now she understood that the 2 things were the same. She stood up. She straightened her jacket. She went back to her desk. Raj looked up. He turned his chair 3 degrees in her direction. He said, "Well?"
I said, "He's staying."
Raj nodded slowly. He turned back to his screen.
I sat at my desk. I opened my laptop, and for the first time since I had arrived in Singapore with $300 and one dream, I felt something I had not felt before. Not relief, not pride. Something quieter than both. The specific feeling of having asked the right question at the right moment and known, before the answer came, that you were ready for whatever it was going to be. Thursday, the 12th floor, the city below, and somewhere in a small apartment 2 floors above mine, a woman who had been waiting 3 years for this afternoon was probably making tea. I would knock on her door tonight. I would not need to say much. She would already know. She always already knew. That was the thing about Mrs. Chen. She did not wait to be told. She listened for what wasn't said. And in 11 years of English, in classrooms and airports and coffee shops and conference rooms and corridors at 3 a.m., nobody had ever told Maya Santos that this was the hardest thing to learn. Not the words, the silence around them. Not the answer, the question underneath it. Before I knocked on her door that evening, I stood in the corridor and I opened SpeakPro. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because the whole day had been about the gap between words and what they mean. I pressed record. I said the 4 words out loud. The app scored my pronunciation. It told me one word was slightly off. Not wrong, just not quite right. I said it again. Better. I said it a 3rd time. The score turned green. I put my phone in my pocket and I thought, this is what practice actually is. Not performing for someone who will tell you you're wonderful, performing for something honest enough to tell you when you're not, and then doing it again until you are.
She knocked on Mrs. Chen's door at 7 p.m. Mrs. Chen opened it before the second knock. She looked at Maya. She said nothing. Maya said nothing. Then Mrs. Chen stepped back and Maya walked in, and they sat in their usual places, and outside Singapore did what it always did. Existed at full volume without asking anyone's permission. And Mrs. Chen made tea. And for the first time since Maya had arrived in this building, the silence between them was not full of things unsaid. It was full of things understood, which is a completely different kind of silence, and considerably rarer.
I thought about what I would tell my mother the next time I called. I thought about the 4-second pause and the second interview, and the $300 and the plate of food outside my door on the morning of my first day. I thought about how far a person can travel in 4 months when they stop trying to sound like someone they're not and start listening for what the room is actually saying. I picked up my tea. I looked at Mrs. Chen. I said, "He said the 4 words."
I know.
I said, word for word.
They usually do when someone finally asks.
Outside, Singapore at night, and 2 women in a small apartment drinking tea, and a card in a jacket pocket that had traveled from a boardroom in Singapore 11 years ago to a corridor in London and back again, and had finally arrived where it was always going, in the hands of someone who understood what it said. Not because she had studied the words, because she had learned the silence they lived inside.
End of episode 3. I'll see you in episode 4. Something is coming that I did not expect, and I think you won't expect it either.